Garnet Creek, Unorganized Territory, Autumn 1877. When Klaus Richter began laying the foundation for his cabin, his neighbors thought he had simply miscalculated. The footprint he cleared and leveled was generous, a full 30 feet by 24 feet, standard for a family with prospects. But the walls he began to raise were an object of pure confusion, and soon of open mockery. He was building two of them. He laid his outer wall first, a traditional assembly of saddle-notched lodgepole pine, each log a respectable 10 inches in diameter. It went up just as any other cabin in the valley, a familiar sight against the backdrop of the coming winter. But then he stopped. Instead of beginning the roof, he moved inward and started again, laying a second, smaller rectangle of logs inside the first, leaving a gap between the two structures that was nearly 2 feet wide. The resulting interior space was shockingly small. A cabin with the exterior promise of a comfortable homestead was being strangled from within, reduced to a living area barely larger than a trapper's line shack. It was an absurdity. It was a waste. And in a land where waste was a synonym for death, it was seen as a profound foolishness. At the trading post, the talk was merciless. Silas Croft, a man who had built nearly half the cabins in the valley and whose opinion on timber was held as gospel, declared it a fool's errand. He explained to anyone who would listen that the man was building a coffin, not a home. The German immigrant, Richter, was wasting precious logs that could have been a woodshed or a small barn, on a hollow wall that would do nothing but trap the cold. He was building a monument to his own ignorance. The laughter that followed was coarse and certain. What did this quiet, stubborn foreigner, a man who had only been in the territory for 2 seasons, understand about survival that men born to this cold had missed for generations? The problem of winter in that high valley was a brutal and unchanging equation of physics and biology. Cold was a thief that stole heat through every chink in a wall, every pane of glass, and every inch of uninsulated roof. The standard cabin of the era was a single-walled fortress of thick logs, chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and animal hair. It was a design born of necessity and tradition, and it was fundamentally flawed. The massive logs themselves, while seemingly substantial, were poor insulators. A solid 10-inch pine log possesses an R value, the measure of its resistance to heat flow, of approximately 12.5. By modern standards, this is profoundly inadequate. The result was a life dictated by the iron stove. These cast-iron beasts, hailed as marvels of the age, were voracious and inefficient. They had to be fed constantly, consuming a staggering volume of firewood. A typical family might burn through 15 to 20 cords of wood in a single winter, a monumental labor of felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking that dominated the brief summer months. The heat they produced was intense but fleeting. It radiated outward, superheating the air nearest the stove to an uncomfortable 80 or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, while the far corners of the cabin remained stubbornly close to freezing. Water buckets left by the door would develop a skin of ice overnight. The walls themselves were always cold to the touch, constantly pulling warmth out of the room and out of the bodies of the people inside. This constant battle created a life of tiered misery. Children were warned away from the scorching surfaces of the stove, yet were told not to stray too far into the cold zones of the room. At night, families huddled together under piles of blankets and animal hides, breathing air that grew colder with each passing hour as the fire dwindled to embers. Waking in the pre-dawn dark was a shock to the system, the air sharp and frigid in the lungs. The first task of every day was a desperate, shivering attempt to coax the fire back to life. Smoke was another constant companion. In the extreme cold, chimney downdrafts were common, filling the poorly ventilated space with acrid smoke that stung the eyes and coated every surface with a greasy film of soot. Sickness from simple colds to deadly pneumonia thrived in these conditions of fluctuating temperatures, poor air quality, and dampness from condensation on the cold interior walls. This was the accepted reality. It was the price of living in the high country, a hardship to be endured, not a problem to be solved. Klaus Richter, however, did not see it as an immutable law of nature. He saw it as a failure of design. He was not a woodsman by birth, nor a trapper. In the old country and the forested hills of the German Confederation, his family had been oven builders. For generations, they had constructed the great Kachelofen, the masonry heaters that formed the warm heart of European homes. He was a master of stone, clay, and fire. He understood heat not as a wild force to be contained, but as a gentle energy to be captured, stored, and slowly released. He had spent his life working with thermal mass, with the profound ability of dense materials to absorb and hold energy. He knew that the American iron stove was a savage, wasteful thing. It burned hot and fast, sending the majority of its heat straight up the chimney along with smoke and combustible gases. A Kachelofen, by contrast, was a slow, thoughtful engine. It burned a small, hot fire for a short period, routing the hot gases through a serpentine maze of masonry channels before they ever reached the chimney. By the time the exhaust left the structure, it was cool to the touch, having surrendered more than 80% of its thermal energy to the hundreds or even thousands of pounds of brick and stone. That stored heat then radiated out into the home for 12, 16, even 24 hours, a steady, gentle warmth that filled the entire space evenly. When he looked at the log cabins of Garnet Creek, he saw the opposite principle at work. He saw structures with almost no thermal mass, built of a material with poor insulative properties, heated by an appliance that threw its energy away. The solution to him was not to burn more wood. The solution was to build a better box. He was not building a coffin. He was building a thermos. He was building a kiln designed to hold a human life. His experience had taught him a fundamental truth that his neighbors, for all their practical woodcraft, had never been forced to consider. It is far easier to keep warmth in than it is to endlessly create more of it. The construction of his cabin was a slow, methodical process that baffled all who watched. After raising the two concentric log walls, he did not chink them in the traditional way. The outer wall he sealed meticulously, forcing dried moss and a clay slip into every gap until it was as airtight as he could make it. The inner wall, however, he left relatively loose. His focus was on the space between them. This was not to be a hollow, dead cavity. He began filling the nearly 2-foot gap from the stone foundation up to the eaves with a loose mixture of whatever insulating material he could find. He used sawdust from the nearby timber mill, which most considered a nuisance and a fire hazard. He used dried moss, chopped straw, and even the collected feathers of countless game birds his wife, Anya, had prepared. He packed it in firmly but not too tightly, creating a thick, breathable blanket of insulation that encircled the entire living space. Silas Croft stopped by one afternoon in late September, chewing on a piece of dried jerky as he surveyed the strange activity. He watched as Klaus tamped down another bucket of sawdust into the wall cavity. "Richter." Klaus straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty hand. He nodded at Silas. "You're wasting good timber on a foolish experiment." Silas gestured with his jerky toward the thick, pregnant-looking walls. "That gap is going to be your doom. It'll fill with cold air, colder than the outside. It'll sweat, the damp will turn to frost, and it'll rot your logs from the inside out within 3 years. You've built a house for mold and mice, not for people." Klaus listened patiently, his gaze steady. He was a man of few words, accustomed to his ideas being met with skepticism. He simply looked at the wall, then back at Silas. "Perhaps. We'll see come January." Silas scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. He was not trying to be cruel, he was trying to be helpful, to save this stubborn man from a fatal mistake. He saw a family, a wife and 2 small children, who would pay the price for this folly. "January will be too late," Silas warned, his voice hardening. "When that north wind blows and your fire can't keep the ice off your own blankets, it'll be too late. There's a right way to build a cabin. This isn't it." He turned and walked away, shaking his head. The conversation was reported later that evening at the Trading Post, cementing Klaus Richter's reputation as the valley's resident fool. The community chorus took up the refrain. Men would make a show of walking around the strange, stout cabin, tapping on the outer wall and then pacing off the meager dimensions of the interior. They called it the Richter box, or the Dutch oven. The jokes were plentiful. They said he was building his walls so thick because he was afraid of the sound of wolves. They said he'd have to go outside to change his mind. The ridicule was constant, a low hum of social pressure that followed Klaus and his family everywhere. The most radical part of his design, however, was yet to come. In the very center of the small interior, he began to build his Kachelofen. It was not a stove. It was a piece of architecture, a solid rectangular mass of stone and clay mortar that rose from the floor nearly to the ceiling. It had a small cast-iron firebox door near the bottom and a simple flue damper, but otherwise it was an inscrutable block of masonry. It took up a significant portion of the already cramped living space. To his neighbors, it looked like he had built an Egyptian tomb in his parlor. They were accustomed to the immediate roaring heat of an iron stove. They could not comprehend how this silent, cold mass of rock could ever warm a house. The physics behind Klaus's masonry heater were elegant and centuries old. The design was centered on maximizing heat transfer and thermal storage. When a fire was lit in the firebox, it was meant to burn hot and fast, for only an hour or 2. This intense, efficient combustion consumed the wood almost completely, minimizing soot and creosote. The critical design element was the path the hot exhaust gases were forced to travel. Instead of venting directly up a chimney, they were routed through a series of internal winding channels, a flue path that could be as long as 15 or 20 feet, all contained within the masonry mass. As the hot gases snaked their way through this labyrinth, they moved slowly, giving up their heat to the surrounding stone and brick through convection and conduction. By the time the gases finally exited into the short chimney pipe near the ceiling, they were often below 250 degrees Fahrenheit, a fraction of the 600 to 1,000 degrees found in a conventional stovepipe. This process effectively captured over 80% of the wood's energy and stored it in the heater's mass, which weighed well over 3,000 pounds. The heater itself became a massive low-temperature radiator, a thermal battery. After the fire was out, it continued to release this stored warmth into the house for the next 12 to 24 hours. The heat was not the scorching, aggressive heat of an iron stove. It was a gentle, pervasive, radiant heat, similar to the warmth of the sun. Radiant heat doesn't primarily heat the air. It heats the objects and surfaces in the room, the floors, the furniture, the walls, and the people themselves. This created an environment of profound and even comfort. eliminating the hot and cold spots that plagued traditional cabins. The surface of the heater itself was designed to be warm, not hot, typically between 120 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit, safe enough to touch or lean against. It was a fundamentally different approach to the problem of staying warm. Anya, his wife, felt the weight of the community's judgment most keenly. She trusted her husband's skill. She had grown up with the deep, comforting warmth of a Katchalofen in her own childhood home. But this was not the old country. Here, the winters were a different beast, a thing of legend. The stories the other women told at the trading post, stories of frostbite, of endless shivering nights, of children sick with lung fever, burrowed deep into her mind. One evening, as Klaus was applying the final layer of clay plaster to the masonry heater, she stood by the doorway, wringing her hands. "Klaus," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Mary Croft was telling me today. She said their cabin gets so cold, the milk freezes on the table. She said Silas has to keep the fire so hot the stovepipe glows red at night, and still they are cold." Klaus did not stop his work, his hands moving with practiced grace as he smoothed the plaster. He knew what she was asking. "She worries for us," Anya continued. She says this pile of rocks will never be enough, that the children will be cold." He finally paused, turning to face her. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, a fear born of social isolation and the terrifying power of communal certainty. He walked over to her and placed his plaster-caked hand gently on her arm. "This is not just a pile of rocks, Anya," he said, his voice soft but firm. "This is a heart for our house. It will store the heat of one small fire and breathe it back to us all day and all night. And the walls," he gestured to the thick, unassuming interior, "they are the blanket that will hold that breath close. Trust me, we will not be cold." His confidence was a small comfort, but the doubt lingered. As the first snows of November began to dust the high peaks, the Richter cabin was finished. From the outside, it looked stout, but unremarkable. On the inside, it was small, almost claustrophobic, dominated by the silent, monolithic heater in its center. The family moved in, and the waiting began. Klaus lit one small, hot fire in the masonry heater each evening, a ritual that seemed absurdly insufficient to anyone who witnessed it. While his neighbors began the relentless, round-the-clock feeding of their iron stoves, Klaus would burn a single armload of wood, then close the firebox and the flue damper, sealing the heat inside the masonry core. The valley settled in for the long, hard siege of winter. December arrived with a punishing cold. Temperatures dropped and stayed below zero for a week. The wind was a constant, keening presence, probing every weakness in the valley's defenses. Inside the traditional cabins, the war against the cold was in full swing. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of scorching iron. The floors were icy, and a thick layer of frost bloomed on the inside of the windows and crept across the walls. Families lived in a small, huddled orbit around their stoves, wrapped in layers of wool and fur. The consumption of wood was immense. Wood piles that had looked like a winter's supply in October were shrinking at an alarming rate. At the Richter house, life was different. The air was clear and still. The warmth was not a point source, but an ambient presence, as if the house itself were alive and warm-blooded. Klaus's 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, could play on the wooden floor in their shirt sleeves. Anya went about her chores without the constant need to huddle near a fire. The windows were clear of frost. The walls were not warm, but they were not cold. They were neutral to the touch, no longer stealing heat from the room. They were burning less than a quarter of the wood of any of their neighbors. Their single daily fire, lasting just over an hour, was enough. The great mass of the Kachelofen and the thick insulated walls held the warmth through the coldest nights. Klaus would place a thermometer on the far wall before bed. In the morning, with the outside temperature at 10 below zero, the interior temperature had dropped only 4 degrees, from a comfortable 68 to a perfectly tolerable 64. But their comfort was a private, unproven secret. The community saw only the foolishness of the design and the stubbornness of the man. The true test, the event that would transform ridicule into legend, was still to come. It began on the 3rd week of January 1878. A pressure system from the Arctic, a vast, dense mass of air, descended from the north. The old-timers called it a Siberian Express. For 2 days, the sky was a strange, luminous gray, and the air was unnaturally still and cold. The temperature plummeted. It dropped past 10 below, past 20, and settled at a terrifying 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Then the wind began. The great freeze of 78 had begun. For the next 5 days, the temperature never rose above -25. The wind howled out of the north at a sustained 40 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 60. The wind chill factor dropped to a lethal 70 or 80 below zero. It was a cold that killed exposed livestock in minutes. It was a cold that made timber as brittle as glass, that froze the sap in the ancient pines until they split open with a sound like a rifle shot. It was a force of nature that sought to extinguish every spark of warmth and life in the valley. For the people of Garnet Creek, it was a catastrophe. The single-walled log cabins were no match for this level of assault. The wind drove the cold through every tiny crack and seam. The chinking, frozen, solid, contracted and failed. Fine, glittering dustings of snow were blown directly through the walls, accumulating in small drifts in the corners of rooms. The iron stoves, which had been glowing red, were now pushed to their absolute limit. They devoured wood at a frantic pace. Men were forced to venture out into the life-threatening cold to the woodpile every few hours, a desperate, dangerous task. Inside Silas Croft's own well-built cabin, the situation was grim. Despite feeding the large Franklin's stove with seasoned oak, the best fuel he had, he could not get the temperature in the room above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife and children were bundled in every blanket they owned, huddled together in one bed. The windows were opaque, covered in a half-inch thick layer of fern-like ice. The water in the bucket by the door was a solid block. Even more frightening, the chimney was struggling. The extreme cold of the outside air was cooling the smoke so rapidly that creosote was condensing and freezing inside the stovepipe, creating a dangerous and suffocating blockage. Twice, Silas had to climb onto the roof in the shrieking, unimaginable cold to try and clear the pipe, a task that left him with frostbite on his fingers and ears. He was fighting a losing battle. His cabin was failing. The traditional way was failing. 3 doors down, at the Richter cabin, the storm was an outside noise, a distant, howling fury that had no purchase on their reality. The Kachelofen, the heart of the house, performed its steady, silent work. Klaus lit his fire as usual, a slightly larger one than normal, but the ritual was the same. The masonry absorbed the heat, and the thick, insulated walls held it fast. The wind hammered against the outer logs, but the 2-foot blanket of sawdust, straw, and feathers, and the still air trapped within it, acted as a profound buffer. The inner sanctum of the house remained untouched. The temperature inside the Richter box held steady at 66 degrees. The children played. Anya baked bread, the warmth from the oven adding to the ambient comfort. There were no drafts. There was no smoke. There was only a deep, abiding, and impossible warmth. The difference in fuel consumption was the most staggering fact of all. While Silas and his neighbors were burning through a massive volume of their winter supply in a desperate round-the-clock frenzy, Klaus was still using little more than a single large armload of wood per day. His design was not just working, it was triumphing with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. On the third day of the storm, a frantic pounding came at their door. It was their closest neighbor, a man named Thomas Miller. His face, visible for a moment in the light of Klaus's lantern, was a mask of ice and desperation. His own cabin's chimney was completely blocked, and the interior was now dangerously cold, the temperature having fallen to just 15 degrees above zero. His youngest child was sick, her breathing shallow and ragged. He was begging for refuge. When Klaus opened the door, Miller stumbled inside, and the contrast between the two worlds struck him with the force of a physical blow. He came from a world of howling wind, biting cold, and acrid smoke. He stepped into a world of serene silence, clear air, and a warmth so profound and gentle it felt like a summer afternoon. He stopped in the middle of the room, his jaw slack with disbelief. He saw the Richter children playing on the floor barefoot. He saw Anya kneading dough on a flour-dusted table, wearing a simple cotton dress. He could feel the warmth on his frozen face, a radiant energy that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He looked at the massive masonry heater, its plastered surface emanating a gentle, steady heat. He touched the interior wall and felt no chill. It was impossible. It defied everything he knew. "My God, Richter," Miller stammered, his voice hoarse. It's warm in here." He looked around the small room, his eyes finally understanding. The thick walls, the central stone mass. It wasn't foolishness. It was genius. They took in Miller's family and the small cabin, which the valley had mocked for its meager size, easily absorbed them. The warmth was not diminished. The heart of the house simply continued to beat. Before I continue with the story of what happened when the storm finally broke, I want you to think about the coldest temperature you have ever personally experienced. Imagine living through that, not in a modern home with central heating, but in a drafty cabin where your only source of heat is a hungry, inefficient stove. Let me know in the comments what that temperature was and what it felt like. And if you're finding this story of ingenuity and survival compelling, please take a moment to press the like button and subscribe for more tales of practical wisdom from history. The Great Freeze lasted for 2 more days. When the wind finally died down and the temperature crept back up to a comparatively balmy 5 below zero, the valley emerged to count the cost. Several homesteaders had suffered severe frostbite. Pneumonia was rampant. Dozens of cattle and horses had frozen to death. The collective woodpiles of Garnet Creek had been decimated, and there were still 2 hard months of winter to go. But a new story was spreading through the valley, a story carried by Thomas Miller. It was a story of a house that had not just survived the storm, but had ignored it. A story of shirt sleeves and children playing on the floor while the world outside was dying. The tale was met with disbelief, then a grudging curiosity. It was Silas Croft who decided to settle the matter. He was a proud man, but he was also an honest one. He had built his reputation on solid, dependable work, and the failure of his own cabin during the storm had shaken him to his core. He had been cold. He had been afraid. And he had heard that the German fool had been comfortable. He could not let it stand without investigation. 2 days after the storm broke, he walked over to the Richter cabin. He was not alone. A small group of other men from the valley trailed behind him, their faces a mixture of skepticism and hope. He carried with him a new and expensive instrument he had acquired from a traveling surveyor, a mercury thermometer encased in brass, certified for accuracy. Klaus saw them coming and met them at the door. He did not look surprised. Silas, never one for pleasantries, got straight to the point. "Richter, Miller is telling stories that are hard to believe." Klaus simply nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The men shuffled in, their boots heavy with snow, and immediately fell silent. The effect was the same as it had been on Thomas Miller. They were hit by the wall of impossible warmth. They looked around the small, bright, clean space. They saw the evidence of normal life, not of desperate survival. Silas Croft's eyes were drawn to the Kachelofen. He walked over to it, his hand outstretched, and cautiously placed his palm against its plastered surface. It was warm, a deep and steady warmth, but not hot enough to burn. He then walked to the furthest wall, the one most exposed to the north, and placed his hand on it. It was cool, but not the biting, heat-sucking cold of his own log walls. Silas unbuttoned his heavy coat, a gesture of submission to the overwhelming comfort of the room. He pulled out his brass thermometer. "The temperature outside, at my cabin, is currently 4 degrees below zero," he announced to the room. He hung the thermometer on a nail on the wall opposite the heater and declared, "We will wait." They stood in silence for 10 minutes, a group of bundled, grim-faced men watching a small column of mercury. The silence was broken only by the quiet sounds of Klaus's children playing with wooden blocks in a corner. Finally, Silas stepped forward and took the thermometer down. He held it up to the light from the window. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the room and spoke, his voice clear and resonant. 68 degrees. A murmur went through the small crowd. 68 degrees. It was a number that represented a different reality. It was the temperature of a mild day in late spring. Silas then walked over to Klaus, who was standing quietly by the heater. He held out the thermometer. "What was the temperature in here?" Silas asked, his voice low. "During the storm? The coldest it got?" 62 degrees, Klaus replied simply. 62 degrees. While Silas's cabin had struggled to stay above freezing, while snow blew through his walls and his family shivered under a mountain of hides, Klaus Richter had been living in a 62-degree environment. The difference was staggering. It was the difference between survival and comfort, between misery and dignity. Silas then asked the question that was on everyone's mind, the question that went to the heart of their own impending crisis. "And your wood? How much have you burned?" Klaus led them outside to his woodshed. The men's eyes widened. His woodpile, which had been the same size as everyone else's at the start of winter, was largely intact. He had used, by Silas's quick estimation, perhaps 3 cords of wood. Silas himself, in just the 5 days of the storm, had burned through nearly 1.5 cords. Klaus was on track to use maybe 5 cords for the entire winter. He would save more than 10 cords of wood, 10 cords of back-breaking labor, 10 cords of security against the unpredictable length and severity of the season. The hard numbers laid the truth bare in a way that no argument or theory ever could. Outside temperature, minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Silas's cabin, an estimated 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Klaus's cabin, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. A temperature difference of 30 degrees between the two homes. A temperature difference of 72 degrees between the inside of the Richter cabin and the outside world. But the most impressive number was the overnight retention. Silas reported his cabin, with the fire banked for the night, would drop 30 degrees by morning. Klaus's had dropped 4. That was the power of the thermal mass, and the super insulation. That was the vindication. They walked back from the woodshed, the group of men quiet and contemplative. They stopped in front of the stout little cabin. Silas Croft, the established expert, the voice of tradition, turned to face Klaus Richter, the quiet innovator, the foreign fool. He looked at the man he had ridiculed, the man whose design he had condemned as a death trap. He took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. "I was wrong," Silas said, the words coming out clear and without hesitation. He looked directly at Klaus, then at the other men, ensuring they all heard his concession. "I was wrong, simply and completely wrong. This works." He then turned back to Klaus and extended a hand, no longer as a skeptic, but as a student. "Richter," he said, his voice filled with a new and profound respect, "will you teach me how to build this?" That moment was the turning point for Garnet Creek. The following spring, Silas Croft, with Klaus Richter as his paid consultant, did not build a single traditional log cabin. He built 3 Richter cabins, as they came to be known, complete with the double insulated walls and the central masonry heater. The first 2 were for families who had lost children to pneumonia in winters past. The third he built for himself. The construction was more labor-intensive and required more materials up front, but the results were undeniable. The adoption was not immediate for everyone. Tradition dies hard. But as the next winter rolled in, and the owners of the 3 new cabins reported the same incredible comfort and fuel savings, the tide turned completely. Within 5 years, nearly every new structure built in the valley, from homes to the new schoolhouse, incorporated Klaus's principles. Older cabins were retrofitted, with residents building a new interior wall and insulating the space between. The demand for masonry heaters was so great that Klaus trained 2 other men, including Silas's eldest son, in the art of their construction. The long-term impact on the community was profound. The health of the valley's residents improved dramatically. The constant, even warmth and better air quality led to a sharp decrease in respiratory illnesses. The quality of life, a difficult thing to measure, but an easy thing to feel, was transformed. Winter was no longer a season of huddled misery, but a time of indoor craft, of social visits to warm, comfortable homes, of life continuing unabated. The economic savings were enormous. With fuel consumption cut by more than half, families had more time and energy in the summer for farming, for prospecting, for improving their homesteads. The forest, once under relentless pressure, was managed more sustainably. Klaus Richter's innovation had not just made life more comfortable, it had made it more secure, more prosperous, and more dignified. What Klaus had built, using ancient principles and careful observation, was an early intuitive version of what modern building science would call a super-insulated envelope combined with a high-mass thermal storage system. His double wall with its loose-fill insulation was a precursor to modern cavity walls and the concept of a continuous insulation blanket. He understood that stopping air infiltration, the wind blowing through the walls, was the first and most critical step. His thick, breathable insulation slowed conductive heat loss, and his Kachelofen was a masterful application of thermal mass, a concept now used in passive solar design and energy-efficient architecture, where dense materials like concrete or stone are used to absorb and slowly release heat, stabilizing indoor temperatures. He had, through practical wisdom, stumbled upon a holistic system where every component worked in concert with the others. The story of the Richter cabin serves as a powerful lesson. It is a testament to the fact that the most entrenched traditions can sometimes be profoundly flawed, and that true progress often comes from an outsider who is willing to question the accepted way of doing things. Klaus Richter was ridiculed, not because he was wrong, but because he was different. His neighbors, trapped in the dogma of their own experience, could not see the wisdom in his design until they were faced with undeniable, quantifiable proof. It was the thermometer, an instrument of cold, hard data that finally melted the ice of their skepticism. And it was the integrity of the primary skeptic, Silas Croft, his willingness to admit his error in the face of that data, that allowed the innovation to spread and benefit the entire community. It is a reminder that ego is a poor insulator against the truth, and that practical wisdom, backed by evidence, will ultimately triumph over dogmatic tradition. This story, while fictionalized, is based on historical building practices and the timeless principles of thermodynamics. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. The construction of any dwelling or heating system, especially those involving combustion, should always be undertaken with professional guidance and in accordance with all modern building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. Do not attempt to replicate historical building techniques without consulting qualified experts.